Good day, everybody. Attorney Greg Lake here. Welcome to the Entheogenic Esquire podcast and YouTube channel. I hope everybody's having a great day today. And for those who were able to make my live stream earlier today, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for joining in. As indicated in this video, I'm going to talk at least briefly about the turning point action. So during the Christmas holidays, I was browsing the web and stuff like that, and I stumbled upon an FEC, a Federal Elections Commission complaint and decision pertaining to turning point action that was rendered in 2024. Now, I think the violations that are actually alleged and were discussed in this FEC opinion actually occurred back in the 2020-2021 election cycle. And so what happened, there was a watchdog group, and I'm about to show you an article that the watchdog group had filed, but it's the same group that filed the complaint against Turning Point Action. And so let's remember that as we're looking through the article. This is the group that filed the complaint. But to be quite honest, I'm not really adept at the election laws. And so while reading through the opinion from the Federal Elections Commission, I don't know enough to really break it down real well for y'all. I can do that if y'all ask me to. I can definitely look into it and get more, nuance with the legality here. However, I will say that there was a violation found on the part of Turning Point Action, and in fact, the violation was one that they admitted to, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I want to show you this article because it does kind of just generally describe why what Turning Point Action was doing wasn't so good for our country based upon the election laws and stuff. And so let's look at it, and then we're done. I want to just briefly discuss this in the context of everything else we've been seeing with, TPUSA, 501c3 violations have been discussed, things of that nature, because it all kind of fits together. So I want to bring it back to the big picture once we're done taking a quick look at this article. So this is from, it says crew. I want to know this entity's name is, hold on just one second. I have right here the actual complaint, and they actually say their name up here. Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. So it was this entity that filed this complaint. I'm not going to go through that, but they did publish this article along with it. And I want to read a little bit from this, and this from March 2021. Crew files complaint against Turning Point Action. So I'm going to read a bit of this. It says, the FEC should investigate Turning Point Action for violating the Federal Election Campaign Act, failing to disclose any of its donors despite making more than $1.4 million in independent expenditures in 2020, according to a complaint filed by this entity. Because it solicited money, it said it would spend supporting President Donald Trump's reelection and Joe Biden's defeat. Turning Point Action was required to disclose contributors who gave it money to influence federal elections or run independent expenditures under a landmark decision won by this entity. So apparently this entity, looks at these different nonprofits and other election entities and tries to hold them accountable based upon filings and other information they come across. They say, according to the FEC reports between August 20th, 2020 and December 31st, 2020, the group spent $1.428 million on independent expenditures in federal elections, but they did not disclose any contributors in those reports. Apparently, this is the law apparently requires certain disclosures of donations to 501c4 like Turning Point Action. And so the whole issue was, did Turning Point disclose appropriately the donors that had given money? Here it says, Turning Point Action is yet another example of dark money groups being used to hide the true sources of big political spending, leaving the public in the dark about who is influencing their elections, even when the law requires disclosure, said Crew President Noah Bookbinder. That's a name, huh? In order to protect the integrity of our elections from such predatory groups, FEC should investigate Turning Point actions. It says TPA expenses went toward online social media ads as well as materials such as door hangers advertising, yard signs, billboards, and banners supporting candidates like President Trump, Tiffany Shedd in Arizona's congressional district, and former Georgia Senators Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue in their races. It says the law requires groups making more than 250 in independent expenditures in a calendar year to disclose the identity of every person contributing more than 200 to the reporting entity. to influence federal elections. So if the money is being given specifically to be spent in support or opposition of a candidate, I think that's what the law requires. That's when you have to disclose these things. And so I think the gist here is that Turning Point Action collected money specifically to go support President Trump, these other politicians, but did not disclose the donors of that money as they should under the law. In closing, the article says this is a rare instance where there is even now a strong campaign finance law, but a strong law only matters if it is enforced. The American people need to know whose money is influencing politics so they can make better decisions to make government work for them, said Bookbinder. With the kind of blatant violation we have seen here, the FEC must promptly investigate. Okay, and so I did take a look again at the actual FEC decision, things of that nature. Now, this number here alleged 1.4 million in donations that were violative. Come to find out, the FEC found that only like $30-something thousand of those were violative, and that 30-something thousand, Turning Point actually admitted that they had screwed it up as far as reporting it appropriately at the timing and stuff. And I think the other issues were really just a matter of timing, in that Turning Point hadn't or had not had a duty to report those whenever they're saying that they did. So again, it seems that there was some violations that Turning Point admitted to. The other part that this crew was alleging, turns out the FEC didn't find that the other bit of that money was in violation of the federal campaign finance laws. But I just want to talk for just 1 second about big picture here. Obviously we're seeing where TPUSA and the other 501c3s, Turning Point Faith, in my opinion, based upon what we see, is pretty much just didn't care about complying with 501c3. It seems to me, again, just my opinion based upon the evidence that we're seeing, that Turning Point Action was kind of along the same veins. However, I think that they didn't have too much intention of complying with 501c4, 501c3, or too much of the election laws. And so, and I want to think like Barron does, that this just blatant disregard for, the laws and, norms, things like that, really had to do with when Erica and these other people came into the Turning Point sphere. I'm still doing some digging on that and looking to see when things kind of like tried to change in a major way. But yeah, so I just wanted to bring this up, is that, TPA, beyond some of the other 501 IRS tax code issues we've seen, have also had FEC issues. Again, they weren't found 100% liable, but we don't know whether there were any political insiders that got involved behind the scenes on this. So what do you think on this, both specifically and in the grand scheme of things? And, do you think that we should be more watchdoggy and staying on top of these things as far as the federal elections and stuff like that? Do you think it's an issue with this different kind of money and stuff, and that these things need to be more transparent? Let me know in the comments. Thank you, everybody. I love you, and let's keep this ball rolling. Peace.